hear my confession. I was born to a good fortune. I had every expectation of a prosperous, respectable future, a career. But always my nature was somewhat divided. A certain duality between the persona that I chose to present to the world and my other self. I must stress these indiscretions, these transgressions, they were mere folly, unbecoming in one of my years, that is all. I respected myself enough. I wished to become a paragon of virtue amongst my peers. I began to consider whether there may be a way of dividing the two. I mean to say, my desire to be held in high esteem was never equal to my desire to indulge in these indiscretions of mine. My studies always tended toward the mystic, the transcendental. What if, I wondered, it were possible to separate the two? No, I say two. That is the number I have been able to find in my experiments. I believe that others will follow where I have led, and they will find many more facets to human nature. Imagine if a compound could be found, a serum, a powder, to separate both halves of the same person. My righteous self, my moral self, no longer need he hang his head in shame. As for the other side of my personality, he could indulge, wallow in his pleasures. And the other need feel no pang of remorse. Unless I began to put these theories to the test. I was missing one last ingredient. A certain quantity of a particular salt, an alkaloid. This I found. And one night, I prepared the serum that was to have such a disastrous effect. I prepared the tincture. I watched it boil and seethe and foam. I drained it. My body was racked with pain. After all, was I not being torn into two? I felt I was dying, or rather, being born again. For when I looked, my hand, smaller, my entire frame had shrunken. I felt lighter, quicker, younger, faster than ever I had done before. I felt giddy. My mind and my thoughts raced like a mill wheel. Raced with wicked, sensuous thoughts. But I wanted to see what I looked like, to introduce myself to myself. It was so early I knew the other servants would be asleep, and so in the theater I scuttled across the courtyard, broke into my own quarters as though I were a common thief, stole up the stairs to my bedroom. For the first time, I set eyes upon Edward Hyde. was so much smaller than I. But then he was young. His muscles nowhere near as well developed. The world had never yet seen one like him. He was the first of his kind. I, and Jeckyll, are both good and bad. Hyde is pure evil. Those indiscretions that made me hang my head in shame, nothing more than folly in my hands. But in those of Edward Hyde, they tended toward the monstrous. I stood aghast at what Hyde did. He takes pleasure in hurting people for jolly, destroying them physically, morally, spiritually, mentally. He delights in the absolute ruination of anyone who crosses his path. People recoiled from him in terror, a thing I've noticed. Feelings of revulsion upon their face. He scares them. He is pure evil. I scurried across the courtyard, once more prepared the mixture, once more returned to my own form. My mind raced. Well, don't you understand now? Whenever I long, sensual pleasures, all I need do is to drink the serum, cast off the fleshy mantle of Henry Jeckyll, become Hyde, slake my appetites, and then cast him aside also. He would disappear like the early morning mist. I even took rooms in Soho, an unscrupulous landlady. She asked no questions. These I furnished. In time, I would open an account in Hyde's name to forge the signature of someone who does not exist. One night, late, Hyde was returning from some act of wanton cruelty back to these rooms. There was a girl that he trampled upon, left her screaming in the gutter. He was observed, witnessed, a cousin of Gabriel's. So it was. Mr. Hyde's presence became known. His fame started to spread.
Whenever I see that house, the one with the door that has the paint blistering, a blackmail house, I always call it. I was saying to my cousin Gabriel just the other day. Now, there's a strange story connected to that house. I was coming back. It doesn't matter from where, late hours, close to midnight. A drama set to unfold before my eyes. Now, from where I was standing, I could see at the juncture of these two individuals about to collide. One of them, you understand, a wee girl, 8 or 9 years of age. As it transpired, she was on her way to fetch a doctor, one of her siblings, a sister, I think. She wasn't he very well? The family had sent her to fetch him. As she was running back to her family, the other gentleman involved, I break out into a sweat just thinking about him, stamping along with his cane, small, almost like a wee dwarf, the clothes hanging off of him, but far from making him seem a comical figure, served to make him seem more formidable. Eventually, of course, they collided. Instead of helping the wee bairn to her feet, he trampled right over her. Seemed to my way of thinking to stamp deliberately upon her. Of course, she was horrified, burst into tears, screaming. He carried on his way. Wasn't he going to have that? I gave chase, run right after him. I collared him and turned him around. The look on his face terrified me. Like the devil himself, Satan, so insolent, arrogant, it seemed to me, taking pride in the injury he had done that poor bairn. He horrified me, yet I can't explain why. I told him to come back. By then a crowd had gathered. The bairn's family, the doctor himself. Now, the doctor, he was about as unemotional as a set of bagpipes. The look on his face, I could have thought he wanted to wring the neck of this gentleman as well. None of us knew the reason why. It just seemed to exacerbate the meaner emotions, fear, anger, violence, making us want to commit violence on him. Oh, he was cool. The one who'd trampled on the girls, he was calming down by now. Sneered at her, saying, "Name our price." Well, I wanted to get something for the bairn's family. £100, I said. He said, for him. That door over there with the blistering, appealing paint, that's where he led us to. Told us to wait outside, he'd go inside. Blackmail house. Has to be blackmail at the bottom of it all. He went inside a few moments later, came out again. A cheque for £90, drawn from the Bank of Coutts. The remainder in coinage, but it was the name, the signature on that cheque, Henry Jeckyll. Well, I knew that Gabriel is friends with Jeckyll. What sort of a situation is it where some fellow goes into another one's house and emerges with a cheque drawn on somebody's account? Well, this fellow seemed to read my thoughts, sneered at us again, said, "Oh, it's all very well." He'd wait with us till the banks opened, waited in my chambers, him grinding his teeth, scaring the living daylights out of us all. In the morning, the banks opened. In he went, bold as brass. Everything was all right and above board. So the family was given the money. There has to be blackmail at the bottom of this. I mean to say, someone lives there. There's always a wee wisp of smoke curling up from the chimney. It must only be a room or two at most. I mean to say, look at the rest of the neighbourhood. And yet there was something about that man, that fellow. I found out his name, Hyde. Edward Hyde. I said the same to Gabriel. Well, you ought to imagine he was concerned when I told him everything I'd seen. I mean to say, late that night, the edge of nowhere. have to say, when Enfield told me of this encounter, it caused me a great deal of worry. I had known Henry Jeckyll for more years than I care to mention it. Well, I went to my wall safe, withdrew his last will and testament, Henry's, I mean. Now, in it, the terms that he stipulated were, should anything happen to him, then all of his wealth, his possessions, they should pass immediately into the hands of this Edward Hyde. I mean to say, if Henry Jeckyll were not seen for 3 months at all, then immediately this Mr. Hyde was to assume control of the law. I was worried about it. As Henry's friend, I was concerned. However, as his lawyer, what choice had I? I had to comply with his wishes. I went to visit a mutual friend of ours, old Llawn. Well, after the usual pleasantries over a fine bottle of wine, I asked Llawn whether he knew anything at all about this Edward Hyde. Nay, he said, since his time. I did settle on him. In his view, he and I, Henry's oldest friends. Aye, he said. Aye, only he hoped there wasn't quite so much of the old. I was intrigued about everything that my cousin Enfield had said about this Hyde character. I mean, I visited Henry on one of the days the following week. He merely reiterated everything that was said in his will. He said if I was friends with him, Jeckyll, I mean, then I must be friends with Edward. He said he was a young man in whose future welfare he had taken a great deal of interest. Now, Henry's servant, Poole, took him to one side. I asked if he had seen this Hyde. He said no, but he did know that Edward Hyde had been given the run of the place. Even his own latchkey. No, I decided I had to catch a glimpse of this Edward for myself. I said, well, if he be Mr. Hyde, I would be Mr. Seek. It was a broad night. Getting home for quite late. I was standing on the street opposite to that blackmail house, what Enfield had told me about. I heard the approach of Edward Hyde before I saw him. A curious scuttling motion, like a spider. Across the street, he hurried to the front door of that ill-omened dwelling. I raced across to him, tapped him on the shoulder. Yeah, my name is Gabriel Utterson, a friend of Henry Jekyll's. I understand you be acquainted with him also. He didn't turn round to me. He said if I wanted to see Jeckyll, I wasn't and looked that he wasn't at home. No, I said it wasn't that. I said I heard a great deal about Edward Hyde, and that I thought it might be worthwhile if I could see what he looked like. I mean to say, should identification be required one day.
He paused and then, and turned to look at me. If ever the mark of a devil was upon a man's face, it was upon that man. Now, I'm no more of a coward than the next, but I was frightened. There was something about him. Made my flesh crawl. When he smiled at me, it turned my blood cold. It was like Satan himself. And yet for all of that, I couldn't even put my finger on what it was precisely. He smiled at me and said, "Oh, well now I shall know what you look like. Well, I know if I have to come and find you one day." He scared me. I backed away a step or two and he went inside the house, slammed it after him. Well, I was in a cold sweat. I hurried away from that spot, turned the corner, decided I would pay a visit upon Henry himself. Poole answered the door. To my shame, I confessed to being relieved when he told me that his master wasn't in. Tired early, I suppose. All of this gave me so much food for thought. I mean to say, Poole telling me that Hyde had the run of the place, that he was allowed to come and to go as he pleased. Well, later that week, I think I was able to have a word with Henry. Now, when I told him that I heard about Edward Hyde, that I'd uncovered one or two facts about him, I could have sworn that Henry turned pale, but he merely reiterated what he'd already said, that he had taken an interest in that young man's welfare. I wasn't to question anything that the will stated. I was merely to do my duty. The tone that Henry uttered this in was quite abrupt. I asked Henry, frankly, was blackmail involved? What power had this Henry fallen under? I mean to say, if Edward Hyde had something incriminating against my friend, then surely we could find something incriminating against Hyde. But Henry, no, he said I wasn't to worry. He said I was merely, as a lawyer, to do my duty, and as a friend, not to fret. But even then, Henry had started to look pale, worried, anxious. I was convinced there was more afoot than what I knew, but I just wish I knew enough to get to the bottom of this eerie business. I remember I'd returned as Hyde lay early one morning. I slumbered. When I awoke, for a while I was not aware where I was, whether in the rooms at Soho or here, in my own bedroom. I held up my hand. But it was not my hand, it was that of Hyde's. I had transformed in my sleep, reverted to Edward Hyde. I was panic-stricken. I was captive inside my own room. How on earth was I get across the courtyard? And then I remembered I had told Poole and the others, Mansfield, the footman, the servant girls, Hyde was to be given free rein to the house, nonetheless. As I emerged from my room, Mansfield, the footman, got the shock of his life. I hurried downstairs across the courtyard, prepared the serum. Once more, I became myself. One thing I had noticed, it was becoming more and more difficult to revert to my own true form, that of Jeckyll. In the beginning, the reverse had been true, to effect the transformation into Hyde, but now Hyde did not wish to go. Hyde also was beginning to become taller, broader, stronger, just as I grew weaker. He and I shared common memories, but that is where it ended. We hated each other. Hyde would have loved nothing more than to bring me down, to ruin me, to destroy me. He did not care if that would annihilate himself in the process. It happened again. Hyde would return. I began to grow afraid. What if I were to sleep and I were to awaken, and not as myself, but as him, as Edward Hyde? I determined that I would have nothing more to do with the drug. All of the evil acts that Hyde committed, I endeavored as best I could to undo, to amend. In some cases, of course, this was impossible. I would return to my philanthropic works. I would forget these follies, these degradations. I would forget Hyde. Yet it will be noted, I did not forsake the rooms in Soho, nor did I discard the suits of clothing that I had got for Hyde. And so my conscience slumbered. For 2 months, I was true to my word. For 2 months was I good, staid Henry Jeckyll. Then, in a moment of weakness, I succumbed to temptation, the drug. Hyde had been caged for 2 months, and now he came out raging. His bloodlust was upon him. He wished to kill. He wanted the blood of someone's life on his hands, to ruin me, to please him. He murdered Sir Danvers Carew. He murdered the old man in cold blood, late that night. Sir Danvers had meant nothing to Hyde, nothing at all to me. He was a friend and a client of Gabriel Utterson's. Yes. I fear that Gabriel Utterson mourned Sir Danvers not a little.